the Japanese marched into Manchuria. The democracies were unable to get together to stop this first major act of aggression, despite the efforts of America's Secretary of State Stimson. And the Japs yelled, "Banzai!" Here at home, John D. Rockefeller, at 93, closed out his days on his private golf course. Look at that swing. Overnight, the Depression was forgotten. The Lindbergh baby had been kidnapped. To help find him, newsreels showed these pictures, which had been taken by Colonel Lindbergh. 2 months later, in May 1932, the baby was found dead. At Flemington, New Jersey, 3 years later, in a sensational trial, Bruno Richard Hauptmann was convicted of kidnapping and murder and sent to the chair. On a routine flight in May 1932, the dirigible Akron dropped her mooring lines in California. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept her skyward, and 3 men with her. 2 of them lost their grip and their lives. In the middle of that summer, 15,000 unemployed veterans camped in Washington, demanding immediate payment of their war bonuses. The government called out federal troops. The bonus army was driven from Washington, and their camp at Anacostia Flats was burned.
On March 4th, 1933, when the outgoing and incoming presidents of the United States drove to the new president's inauguration, America was on the verge of panic. Our banks were failing, our citizens frightened. Franklin D. Roosevelt began his inaugural address.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
America soon got to know the Roosevelts.
My wife is sitting next to me, and on her knee is Anna Eleanor Dall, our oldest grandchild, and then comes my daughter, Anna Dall, and on her lap, Buzzy, and then comes my mother. What's our campaign slogan, Sister?
Happy days are here again.
The NRA's Blue Eagle came out of the New Deal's first 100 days. So did the WPA and PWA, the CCC and the AAA. And in December, beer came back. Happy days were here again. Evangelist Billy Sunday kept on fighting for prohibition.
I am the sworn, eternal, uncompromising enemy of the liquor traffic. I ask no quarter and I give none. I'll kick it as long as I have a foot. I'll punch it as long as I have a fist. I'll butt it as long as I have a head. I'll bite it as long as I have a tooth. And when I'm old and fistless and footless and toothless, I'll gum it till I go home to heaven and it goes home, my friend, to hell.
The Depression had shortened tempers throughout American industry. In the middle 30s, violent strikes broke out across the nation. Tear gas and brickbats took the place of reason. It was a black page in our history. Abroad, King Alexander of Yugoslavia was welcomed by France's great foreign minister Bartu in Marseille. As they rode through cheering crowds, an assassin struck. Police sabers cut him. Alexander, Bartu, and the assassin all died.
The U.S. female, who had been moving in on men's territory since 1900, finally took away her husband's last prerogative, his pants. In May 35, this Callender, Ontario cabin and its French-Canadian owners, Oliva and Alzire Dion, became world famous. Their doctor was Alan Defoe, and their children were the first quintuplets in history to survive. Yes, there were really 5, the Dion quintuplets. The world listened for every coup from little Yvonne, Emily, Cecile, Annette, and Marie. An American sensation was the new young heavyweight contender named Joe Louis. The brown bomber had a murderous right and a left, too. George Bernard Shaw paid us a visit.
They're always glad to see me in America. So now, take a good look at me, because I am the actual, real, original Bernard Shaw. And, now, how do you like me?
Louisiana's kingfish, Huey Long, stumped for his Share of the Wealth program.
How many men ever went to a barbecue and would let one man take off the table what's intended for 9/10 of the people to eat? The only way you'll ever be able to feed the balance of the people is to make that man come back and bring back some of that grub he ain't got no business with.
In the mid-30s, dust storms devoured the drought-stricken farms of the Middle West. Dust Bowl refugees wandered the land, looking for work. They added a new word, Okies, to the dictionary of distress.
Mussolini decreed more babies to man his armies. He got them. He began training his wolf cubs as soon as they could walk. As they got older, their studies broadened. By the time they reached manhood, their training in barbarism was complete. In 1935, against the backward tribes of Ethiopia, Mussolini's wolf cubs got their first glorious chance. Appealing to the League of Nations, Ethiopia's Emperor Haile Selassie was silenced by jeers from the fascisti. Back home, Alf Landon challenged the New Deal but carried only Maine and Vermont.
I believe that a man can be a liberal without being a spendthrift.
In March of 1936, Hitler's new army marched into the Rhineland. The world had started on the road to war. The Olympic Games in Berlin had been planned as a hymn to Nazism, but Hitler's dream was spoiled by an American Negro who ran the Aryan Supermen into the ground. His name was Jesse Owens. That December, the King of England gave up his throne to marry Mrs. Wally Simpson of Baltimore, USA.
But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love.
In 1936, the Dirigible Hindenburg started passenger service across the Atlantic between Germany and Lakehurst, New Jersey. On May 6, 1937, she was coming up to her mooring with 97 passengers aboard. 36 died, ending Atlantic dirigible service forever.
By 1938, Adolf Hitler was ready for conquest.
Warten! Immer! Warten! Up!
In March, the Nazis struck at Austria. Hitler rode into Vienna to take formal possession. Six months later, Neville Chamberlain, England's Prime Minister, went to Munich. With Mussolini and Goering at his side, Hitler bulldozed and cajoled Chamberlain and Premier Daladier of France to sell out Czechoslovakia, the last democratic bastion in Central Europe. Chamberlain foolishly believed he was buying peace in our time. Without firing a shot, the Nazis had won a major victory. Back home, Chamberlain proudly displayed his worthless scrap of paper.
I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
And so the Nazis enslaved Czechoslovakia. Appeasement did not buy peace. Japan, encouraged by Hitler's bold defiance of right with might, stepped up the undeclared war with China. Canton, Suzhou fell before the aggressors. This was the era of refugees, none more pitiful than those caught in the bloody civil war in Spain, the dictator's proving ground for World War II. Nazi Germany? No. Madison Square Garden, USA. The German-American Bund. Led by Fritz Kuhn, America's Nazi admirers, in '39, used Hitler's methods to deal with their opposition. Lou Gehrig, struck out by disease, said goodbye to 70,000 choked up fans at Yankee Stadium, baseball's courageous Iron Man to the end.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Ruth and Gehrig, greatest of all. On September 1st, '39, without warning, the German training ship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on Poland. These were the opening guns of World War II. Nazi troops crossed the Polish border. England and France declared war. Russia, now Hitler's ally, stayed out. First bombs dropped on Warsaw. In 1 month, it was all over in Poland. After a winter of the phony war, the Nazi blitzkrieg hit. For the second time in a generation, Belgian roads swarmed with refugees, blocking troop movements, part of the deliberate Nazi plan. The Allies fell back upon the sea. The miracle of Dunkirk rescued a whole army, but Allied might on the continent was broken. The dictator Mussolini declared war on France.
On this 10th day of June, 1940, the hand that held the dagger has struck it into the back of its neighbor.
On June 13th, Paris fell. A week later, at Compiègne, Hitler received the French surrender in the very railroad car where in 1918 the Germans had surrendered to Marshal Foch. Der Führer was elated. Now it was London's turn. On July 10th, 1940, the Battle of Britain began.
When Hansel and Gretel had lost their way in the woods, John said, "Oh, look what I see. I see a sugar house. Come on and we'll run down to it."
Even as the bombs rained down, the people of Britain found courage in the words of their new leader, Winston Churchill.
Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be freed. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty. So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its commonwealths last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
Back in America, an army without arms went on maneuvers. Wendell Willkie, the Republican presidential nominee, fought Roosevelt's third term, but supported the nation's preparedness program. And in October, our first peacetime draft began.
The first number drawn by the Secretary of War is serial number 158.
Hitler and Mussolini hoped for victory before America was ready. The Nazis invaded Russia in June 1941, and the free world turned to America, now the arsenal of democracy. Off Newfoundland, Winston Churchill met Franklin Roosevelt. Their unparalleled working friendship began with the Atlantic Charter. Planes attacked without warning.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
In May of 42, the Japs finally overwhelmed the gallant defenders of Bataan. To General Jonathan Wainwright fell the heartbreak of surrender to Japan's Masaharu Homma on Corregidor. 6 months later, America was on the offensive. The GIs landed in North Africa. From El Alamein, Britain's 8th Army smashed across Africa to Desert Victory. In March 43, the British and Americans met. The tide of battle was beginning to turn. The Germans would hear more of the team of Eisenhower and Montgomery. That summer, Germany began to feel the combined might of the Allied air forces. The RAF flew by night. The Americans, briefed before dawn, flew by day. American power had swung the tide in 1918. Now it was swinging it again. On the home front, it was a story of shortages, of rationing, of sharing, and of saving. Service stars appeared in windows, rolls of honor in every town. From our shipyards, whole convoys took our unbelievable production overseas. In Europe, Nazi commandos rescued Mussolini. Later, the Italians themselves brought him to justice. His career was over. It had destroyed itself. In the Pacific, an ocean had to be won, island by island, Jap by Jap. This was Tarawa. On June 4th, Rome was liberated. Its citizens were free after a quarter of a century of fascist enslavement. Just 2 days later, it was D-Day. In the greatest invasion in the history of warfare, the Allies smashed ashore in Normandy, June 6, 1944. The Allied air forces, skimming the Channel cliffs of France, hedge-hopping across Normandy, kept German supplies from the front. At Saint-Lô, General Bradley's armies broke out of the hedgerows and raced for Paris. In Paris, the French themselves, rounding up Nazi troops, struck the first blow for their liberation. Then, in one of the great emotional moments in all history, passions pent up during 4 years of Nazi occupation burst out on the citizen army from Connecticut and California, Texas, and Tennessee. And on their commanders, Eisenhower and Bradley. The GIs marched in their fathers' footsteps down the Champs-Élysées. Paris was free. Airborne troops struck at Arnhem. One paratrooper took his own picture as he jumped. The Allies reached the Siegfried Line in September. The Battle of Germany began. 6 months later at Remagen, the GIs crossed the only Rhine bridge left standing, and Americans kept the watch on the Rhine. Iwo Jima, and another H-hour in the Pacific. Here on 8 square miles of volcanic ash was fought the bitterest battle in Marine Corps annals. Finally, the Yanks came back to the Philippines. In violent combat, Manila was liberated. And General MacArthur returned to Corregidor.
I see that the old flagstaff still stands. Have your troops hoist the colors to its peak, and let no enemy ever haul them down.
With victory in sight, the Allied chieftains met at Yalta to plan for cooperation in the post-war world. Back from Yalta, Franklin Roosevelt made his last public appearance.
It's been a long journey. I hope you'll also agree that it has been, so far, a fruitful one. Speaking in all frankness, The question of whether it is entirely fruitful or not lies to a great extent in your hands.
And on April 12th, the nation was stunned by the news that the commander-in-chief was dead. It was hard to believe.
Victory was being won. Americans like these carrier pilots in wounded planes were paying the price for that victory. The carrier war in the Pacific reached its climax in the suicide attacks by Japanese kamikaze pilots off Okinawa. USS Franklin, her magazines hit by a kamikaze, blew up. On her burning deck, the Franklin's chaplain gave last rites to the dying. Other crewmen jumped to safety. Under her own power, the Franklin came home. America led the peace. In San Francisco, Russia's Gromyko, Britain's Halifax, and 48 other delegates signed the United Nations Charter. Secretary of State Stettinius signed for the United States while our new president looked on. The Nazis quit first. The Germans signed at Reims, and General Beadle Smith gave General Eisenhower the pens of the unconditional surrender. With Berlin itself had come crumbling down Hitler's dream of conquest. Whatever was left of his body was here in his shattered Reichschancellery. Another tyrant had met his inevitable end. Then the Jap tyranny was blasted. The atom bomb fell on Hiroshima. This was one bomb's toll. 2/3 of a city obliterated. Aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the Second World War, in which 56 million had been killed or wounded, came to an end. General MacArthur signed for all the Allies. One pen went to Wainwright of Bataan. Admiral Nimitz signed for the United States.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always.
Yes, it was over everywhere. Peace. It was wonderful. New York's Mayor LaGuardia read the comics on the radio.
Here's Dick Tracy. Let's see what Dick Tracy is doing. And the picture shows a hand of Breathless stretching out. She's got hold of that iron pot. Remember the iron pot she took from the Van Hoosen's gardener's flat to put the money in? And crash! She crashes it on his head. Knocked out. And say, children, what does it all mean? It means that dirty money never brings any luck.
Nuremberg, Hitler's gang, the men behind the gas chambers where 12 million died, went on trial. Goering, Hess, all the inner circles still alive, faced Allied justice to show the world that might does not make right. The trial of the Jap war criminals followed in Tokyo. Among them was Hideki Tojo, Japan's Pearl Harbor premier. He hears the verdict, death by hanging. In the United Nations Security Council in April 46, Russia's Andrei Gromyko raised his hand to cast a lone dissenting ballot in debate on Russia's intervention in Iran. Outvoted, he walked out. History's most appalling war was not yet 1 year past. Once more, force challenged reason. Mankind now had one road to survival, permanent peace. At Bikini, the world glimpsed the alternative. Fire! Russia, too, would have the atom bomb. To Gandhi's India came freedom. With it came Gandhi's death. The world mourned the man who, winning independence without violence, proved that good can conquer evil.
In London, Britain's royal family greeted a future King of England, Princess Elizabeth's son, Bonnie Prince Charlie. America now led the worldwide fight for freedom. In Czechoslovakia, tyranny won. Premier Gottwald danced to Moscow's tune. To that same tune danced the Italian communist Togliatti. But many more Italians listened as Pope Pius XII exhorted them to repudiate the Reds. Here, tyranny was beaten at the polls. In Berlin, an island of Western influence in a sea of red control, East and West displayed their strength in rallies. Neither side won. In the Republic of Israel, born May 1948, the free nations of the world had gained an ally. Guided by Premier Ben-Gurion and President Weizmann, its future would be closely tied to that of the United States. At home, a beloved figure whose career had spanned most of the half-century said farewell. Soon afterwards, Babe Ruth was safe at home.
There's been so many lovely things said about me, and I'm glad that I've had the opportunity to thank everybody. Thank you.
Nobody but the president himself gave Harry Truman a chance in the 48 election. But Mr. Truman plugged away at his whistle-stop campaign while the experts, to a man, predicted that our next president would be the confident Thomas C. Dewey.
I pledge to you that on next January 20, there will begin in Washington the biggest unraveling, unsnarling, untangling operation in our nation's history.
On election night, the result was in doubt for hours. The pollsters were wrong. Good-natured fun had a certain radio commentator.
At along 12 o'clock, I happened to wake up for some reason, and the radio was turned on the National Broadcasting Company. And Mr. Kelton-Barn was saying, while the president is 1 million votes ahead in the popular vote, we have yet to hear from the...
In the skies over Germany, despite all kinds of weather, America made good its promise to the people of occupied Berlin. Russia's blockade of Berlin failed as the Allied airlift accomplished the impossible and supplied the city by air. Other U.S. supplies helped the world maintain its freedom through the program conceived by soldier statesman George C. Marshall.
Make no mistake about it, the chips are down. Winning this struggle is as vital to the peace and prosperity of the world as any military campaign in history. Indeed, unless we achieve victory, our greatest military and financial sacrifices may have been largely in vain, I fear.
America told the world it meant business. In China, the chips were down as the communist armies marched into Shanghai and to complete control of a nation of millions. Russia had gained a mighty friend. Russia had lost a friend in Marshal Tito's Yugoslavia. But in East Germany, new Reds paraded like Nazis of old.
Just as it always had, the American idea of freedom faced powerful challenges as the first 50 years of this century drew to a close. The worst of these challenges was Russian communism, the exact opposite of freedom. It threatened free men all around the world. Terrible new weapons, now in Russia's hands as well as our own, make it necessary that we face the threat squarely, with malice toward none, but fully armed physically and morally against any emergency. For as a result of the 50 great years that have passed before our eyes, the United States of America is entering the second half of this century as the most powerful nation in the world. The American idea of freedom, kept bright through hardships, doubts, and attacks, has led millions upon millions to look to us for leadership. It is no accident that America has achieved this leadership with its magnificent opportunities and its heavy responsibilities, for America didn't just happen. Our country, more truly than any in history, has reflected the principles of righteousness and of the dignity of the individual which spring from the great teachings of all great religions, principles founded on the firm belief that man is created in the image of God. Governments which deny these principles must in the end destroy themselves, as we have seen in our own lifetime. Only freedom can go on forever, but only the strong can be free. With firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, we shall strive on to achieve a just and lasting peace, and to realize for ourselves and for all the world, in the next 50 years, the wonderful accomplishments we have begun in the past 50. We shall guard our freedom with our hearts, our minds, and our lives, that all of those who have died to hand this freedom on to us, like Private Roger Young of Green Springs, Ohio, USA, shall not have died in vain.